Pleasure speaking with you. You know, massive fan of Lighthouse over the years. I've had a chance to interview you over the phone. We've done red carpets. Before we talk about the anniversary, I just want to ask, what do you think it was about Lighthouse that made it so special? I always found it funny that I always wondered that did people get Lighthouse mixed up with Chicago because you guys had a similar type of sound back in the day?
Yes, people used to kind of confuse Lighthouse with Chicago and sometimes even with Blood, Sweat, and Tears because all
Yeah.
three of us were horn bands that achieved some success with airplay and touring and all of that kind of stuff. And what made us different from a musical point of view is that the idea for Blood, Sweat, and Tears was they took basically a rock and roll concept, but they used jazz horn players and they had a jazz drummer. So jazz drummers go ching, 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 they play kind of swing beats, right? And rock and roll drummers do it even like different thing. So with Lighthouse, we decided musically to do two things that were different. One is that our guitar, bass, and drums, our nucleus, would stick to rock and roll kind of rhythm section. And the other thing was we added a whole string quartet. So that gave us a different, a more sort of orchestral, I wouldn't like to say classical music sound because they weren't playing classical music. But anyway, they added the strings. So on a simplistic way, that was different. But I think on a more important way, the way that Lighthouse was different than Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago, and pretty well most of the bands of the classic rock era, is they were really concentrating on fighting against the man and all kinds of images that had to do with resistance and uh, and violence. And the lyrics to Lighthouse songs over all the years we've been together, not because we sat down and said we're going to focus on doing uplifting, sort of nice music, but just because that's the kind of music that came out of the people that was in the band. So we've had so the names of our songs, One Fine Morning, Sunny Days, Good Day. So many of our songs and our Hats Off to the Stranger are kind of have uplifting lyrics. So if you think of kind of the orchestral thing and the kind of lyrics that we wrote to our songs, that'll give you some difference. Of course, if you're a musicologist or somebody who's super into music theory, you can find differences between the bands. But there was a lot of crossover, and we influenced each other a lot. Blood, Sweat, and Tears was first. They made the first album, followed shortly thereafter by Lighthouse, and then Chicago, which in those days was called CTA, which stood for Chicago Transit Authority.
So we are talking about the anniversary of One Fine Morning. Um, the fact that it's being re-released. What is going on with this re-release? What are some of the special things we're getting from this?
The special things about this release are are again, I'll boil them down to a couple of simple things that everybody will understand.
Of course.
Back in 1970, when One Fine Morning LP was released, the sound of LPs was not very good. We used to call it the Rice Krispie effect, snap, crackle, and pop. And that was because back then the price of oil had been going up, and the record companies, in order to save money, decided to take the nice thick, uh, heavy weight of vinyl that they used to use in the presses, and except for a few boutique record companies that specialize in audiophile, good quality recordings, all of the pop recordings were recorded with instead of 200 grams of vinyl stuff with about 120. So it's almost maybe 60% of what they should have had. The result was thinner records that didn't sound very well, very good. But the other thing that was probably just as important as the technology back then, the analog audio technology, was such that you couldn't get a lot of low frequencies on a record. You could either have a lot of low frequencies, like maybe Deutsche Grammophon, the classical record companies would have, but then you couldn't have as much time. You couldn't put as many songs on a pop record. So if you wanted to put more songs on, the grooves would have to be squinched together. And when they do that, if you put a lot of bass on, then the needle would skip. So you had to compress the bass. You couldn't have stereo bass. The bass would be in the center because of technical things and this and that and the same kind of thing. And in the higher frequencies, you couldn't have a really nice crisp high end. So they had to roll off the high end, because if you had a lot of highs, the cutting head of the thing that made the master for the LPs would get overheated, and those back then cost $500 to replace. So by the time the records came out as records, as LP vinyls, the sound had been deteriorated for technical and economic reasons. So one of the reasons that we wanted to redo the recording was, nowadays, when LPs basically totally faded out and nobody bought them at all for a while. And then about 10 or 20 years ago, people started making small batches of LPs, but they tended to be more expensive than they used to be. And because they had enough money, they went back up to the 180 to 200 gram weight that they should have had. And they had a nice, thick, good impression. And so the sound of LPs today is much better than it was back then. But then we came to the actual master recordings, where over the last 50 years, the improvements of audio technology have just, been numerous. So we said, why don't we don't want to lose the performances of the original record, because that's why we're doing a reissue. It was our it still is our biggest selling album. Most of the songs we do in our show come from that album. And so we said, okay, what we'll do is we'll keep that, but now there's all this new technology, including artificial intelligence, AI, and we could take the old recordings and demix them. So we could get back from the mixes that are on the masters that we have now, and get back to a bass track and a drum track and a vocal track and the horns and that kind of thing. And so we were able to unmix the old stuff, remix it, add back all of that bass that was missing, add back all of that treble that was mixing, but not have to do it to the overall mix, to do just like, people said, those old mixes, our drummer, my co-founder, Skip Prokop, was fantastic. His bass drum parts, instead of just being bum, ba bum, he'd be doing chugga gong 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 gong. He was doing all these kind of funk things and all these kind of things that didn't show up in the old mixes. So we could go back to the old drum parts and just pick out the frequencies of the bass drum and pick that out. And we did that with all the instruments and all the vocals on the record. So the sound is immensely expanded. The dynamic range is immensely expanded. And it just sounds really fantastic. The other thing we said is, how can we add something new? Because
Yeah.
we didn't just want to do a reissue. So we spoke to our record company, Anthem, and we said, why don't we just take a look at the archives and see what we can find? Maybe there's some stuff that was never released. And goodness gracious, when we looked in the archives, we found 10 of the demos that my bandmates and I had made for the recording, that we gave to our producer, Jimmy Einer. He listened to those 10 demos and in his judgment decided to make this album back in 1970 using 5 of them redone for the album
Wow.
and throwing away the other 5, which nobody ever heard, including the people in the band who didn't play on their bandmates' demo. So we found these 10 demos, and when I listened to them, I was intrigued, a little bit flabbergasted, and I thought it would be really interesting, not just for me, but for everybody else who had never heard these, to hear both the demos that never made it on the record, and then everybody could have their own opinion on maybe why. How, I wonder why they didn't release this. This is a really maybe better than one of the other songs on whatever it is. And the ones that did make it on, and I'll use as an example One Fine Morning, which was the biggest single on the One Fine Morning LP. And on that one, the demo was sung by Skip Prokop, who sang the demo and played acoustic guitar on it. And instead of playing keyboards, which I played most of the time in Lighthouse, for the demo, I was just playing on conga drums. And we were thinking of a kind of a Latin feel, like almost like a Santana kind of thing. So on a demo, when I heard it, and when the people who listened to it for the first time, they'll hear something that has almost a Latin kind of feel instead of that heavier rocker feel. And you won't hear the lead singer in the band, Bob McBride, because until the producer decided that we would do that demo, we didn't give it to Bob and do the string arrangements and the horn arrangements and everything else. So in both cases, I thought that it would be interesting for people today to listen to the best performances of yesterday with the best sound of today, and to get this extra material. And there's extra photographs that we found, a lot of extra. We got the guys who played on the original One Fine Morning album, about half of whom are still alive today. And we got them to write little liner notes about looking back on it, what they did. So the thing is, there's all kinds of extras and all kinds of new stuff that make this new double album set quite a bit different, and I think much more relevant today than the original.
Before we wrap this up, from that album, which of course is considered one of the greatest of all time, which particular song did you enjoy performing live from this classic LP and why?
If you ask me about different albums, I might have trouble, but from that album, it's really interesting because our producer, Jimmy Einer, had given us all instructions. We had to make our songs shorter because in those days, AM radio, you couldn't have a song longer than 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes.
Right.
So he said, you got to get rid of all the solos, all the intros, all this stuff. One of the songs on the album that we assumed would never get on the album was that same One Fine Morning out, before we knew what the album was going to be called, One Fine Morning. And when we played it, Skip looked over at me and he said, you know what? I'm really hearing a jazz piano solo right in the middle of this. And so we said to our producer, listen, we want to do a jazz piano solo. We know that you don't want any solos. Maybe we should record it with the piano solo. And if you think it's too long and you don't want to put it on the album, that's okay. And if you think that it's too long and you do want to put it on the album, just cut out the piano solo. So Jimmy and I said, okay, we recorded it with this jazz piano solo that I played once and never played again since then, because it was a jazz solo and it was for the time. And then what happened was, when we finished recording, and we recorded, I think there were 10 songs on the album. But usually what you do if you're an artist, if you know there's going to be 10, you record 12 or 13. So you see, after they're all finished, you take the 10 best ones.
Right.
When Jerry had to make the decision for which were the 10 best, he listened to the One Fine Morning, and he really thought that it should be on the album. So anyway, he decided to leave it on the album, even though it had an intro of bass and just bass and drums doing a kind of instrumental kind of hooky thing. And he just said, "Listen, it's not going to be the single. Let's leave it on the album because I think it's a good song." We left it on the album. It was time to get a single from the album. The record company decided on Hats Off to the Stranger. They released that as the first single on the album, and it did pretty good. It broke the Billboard top 40. It was, I can't remember, maybe number 32 or something. And the record company said, "Oh, that's a good start. Why don't we see if there's another single?" And they went to all the DJs around the United States and Canada and said, "You guys, what do you think the single should be?" And 100% of them said it should be One Fine Morning. So Jimmy said, "Okay, I'm going to do an edit. I'm going to take out the piano solo, and we'll put out One Fine Morning as a single." And so they did, and it started to get some airplay. But some of the people who had bought the album, I don't know how many, maybe a lot, but enough, started phoning the radio stations, and they said, "How come the album has the piano solo in it and the single doesn't? Could you put out a version with that?" So they put out a version with the piano solo, and all the radio stations stopped playing the short one. And what that meant was when we started touring, I kept my piano solo in. And so to me, it had a special meaning, and I love playing it to this day.
Oh my goodness, Paul, I gotta say as we wrap this up, that is an amazing story. Look, my friend, we gotta do this again soon because I know you've got hundreds of great stories. I gotta say, like I said, um, Lighthouse has been a big part of my family growing up. Um, I will always treasure the music. I am so glad this is not just the fact that it's being re-released the way it is, but it's being re-released over the holiday season. It will make an amazing gift underneath the Christmas tree for young and old. My friend, thank you so much for this interview, and let's talk again soon.
Thank you, Rudy.